It's our first language and communication research seminar for this year, so we hope to see you all in our next seminars as well. And it gives me absolutely great pleasure to introduce Leena Robertson. Just realised that your name is Leena. I used to call you Leena, but it's good that you checked your name. For our first seminar. Now Leena is Associate Professor in Education here at Middlesex. She researches extensively on multilingualism, education, literacies, cultures, and her latest, and also she has experience working with multilingual learners and with teacher training, and her latest project has been a massive EU-funded project called RomTel, which looks at Roma language and trans-language practice in education in different European countries. And one thing that came out from that project is how do Roma students call their language? And they call it our gypsy language, so how should we call their language? And what are their practice of naming a language that is not perhaps as formal or as recognized or as standardized? So Leena is going to talk to us about that. We're so excited.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here today. This is new work that I've been wrangling with all summer, writing a paper on this part of the project. So it's really nice to talk it through to people who are interested in the same similar issues and matters. So, like Anna said, one of the critical moments within the big project, and I'll tell you about the project in a minute, was this point when the participants, the Roma people, said about their own language that they speak, our gypsy language. And this really sort of ignited a different strand of analysis within the project that related very much to ethics. It also related to language methodologies. What methodologies do we use to investigate and explore languages? And a big part of this whole project was rooted to social justice. So similarly, to what extent our methods are good enough to promote social justice? Are there issues to do with social justice that we had not planned for? So this, our gypsy language, wasn't just mentioned here with the participants here, the Roma people here in England. They said the same thing in France, in Finland, and in Romania. When we asked what language you speak at home, they said our gypsy language. And the whole project wasn't so much about what language you speak, but what do you do with the home languages that you speak. That's what our project was all about. We called it RomTels, which means Roma, or is shortened, Roma Trans-Language Inquiry Learning Space. There's the link to the website that has plenty of information about the overall project. I haven't got time to talk so much about the project, but if you're interested, please go and have a look. So just to mention that the project we worked with people from recent migrants from different Eastern European countries, and the idea of the project itself was to develop this trans-languaging pedagogy for Roma pupils in order to draw on their semiotic resources, their strengths that they know about the world in their own home language, and how can teachers in schools where they don't speak the language, how can they make use of that conceptual base that the children have? That's what we were interested in. And we developed this weird-looking trans-languages space. It looks something like from a hospital, doesn't it? Really clinical and not at all nice. So it was a high-tech space. We had money to develop 360-degree screens around this space on which we could project videos and all sorts of resources. We had an interactive table instead of an interactive whiteboard. So it was a table that operated like an interactive whiteboard, but it was a table so everybody could get around and help each other. So what we wanted to do is this high-tech, expensive space in Newcastle used that as an inspiration to develop work then in Romania, France and Finland. So 2 stages. First, this weird looking space and activities there, videoed, explored, analysed, and then what can we learn from that that can be then made use of in those 3 countries. So part of those screens was the idea that we would have this immersive space. They go into that clinical looking space, but because the videos are projected around them, you begin to feel that you've come to a different place. And we had characters specially developed for the project that we wanted to speak in 2 languages. So some of the series of lessons that related to the national curriculum of England related to inquiries, like children going to ancient Baghdad, because the year 5 curriculum here in England says that you have to study, in history, you have to study an ancient civilization. So the idea was then that we developed these videos and films where the children felt that they'd gone to ancient Baghdad, because the characters and the background looked like ancient Baghdad. So it was these characters that we then wanted to speak in 2 languages, a Romani language and English. And it was at this point when we said to the parents, so what Romani language do you speak? Our Gypsy language, they told us. And if you're wondering all this complicated stuff that I've already talked about in terms of the project, I haven't got time to explain any of that beyond what I've done just now. But if you are interested, do go and have a look at the website. We've got the theoretical framing for doing the series of lessons and use in home languages in, for example, in the Teacher Educator's Handbook. Or you might want to start reading the Global Monitoring Report, number 24, that is labelled, if you don't understand, how can you learn? Okay, so there we were, working with participants, families and children, and we wanted to translate what the teachers developed into a Romani language. So, okay, what language? Having been a primary school teacher many years and having researched in various communities, we absolutely embrace the idea that acts of naming are never neutral. Naming one language depends really in which language you name it and whether it's from the insider perspective or outsider perspective. So what our plan was not to start with a language survey where you go and ask, just write here on a dotted line what language you speak, but more conversations where we develop relationships with families before we do the data collection. So we develop conversations about language use, not so much what it is, but what it is, how do you use it at home? And we had planned time for this, so we wanted to do it very sensitively because we know the marginalisation that has taken place around Roma, so we were very aware of that. And so we went into these conversations. And of course, when they started telling us that they call their language as our Gypsy language, that raised a serious ethical question for us, non-Roma researchers, that is it ethical then for us to name all these languages as our Gypsy language? It was the only answer we got from different communities, and we knew that some of these families had moved from Bulgaria to England and Bulgaria to Finland. Some had moved from Czech Republic to Finland and England and so on. So different European countries, different communities moving. So do they all speak the same, our Gypsy language? And yet we were not moving on from this point. So it seemed to us that there was a serious case of non-naming going on, silencing. In fact, when we had began to bid for the money for the European Union Erasmus+, when we looked at what they wanted people to bid for, they often mentioned the Roma community as the most vulnerable of European communities, and that they recommended that people apply and bid for money to work with the Roma communities. Then in the Erasmus Plus website you've got the drop-down menu of languages. You've seen those. You drop it down and there we go, da-da-da-da. You know, French, German, da-da-da-da-da-da. Not a single Romani language there. So it suggested perhaps that even at European Union level there's some serious non-naming going on. And this non-naming isn't just an accidental sort of not remembering. It relates to much deeper, systematic, structural practices in Europe. Similarly, when we looked at the UK census, you know that we do a census here every 10 years in which we reflect and give detail about us to the government so they can better provide services. Well, the UK census has never had a language question except for Welsh in Wales and Scots and Gaelic in Scotland. But in 2011, they first time introduced this language question, wanting to find out not just about Welsh and Scots and Gaelic and all that, but what other languages are spoken in the UK. But the question is framed, what is your main language? And then you write one. There is no way you could write two. Except that some of us who've been activists in this field and have been lobbying the government to introduce this question, of course, like myself, I'm from Finland, you may hear that accent there. Although I've been here a very long time, I consider that my main languages are Finnish and English. So proudly did I write two languages on that line where you should have just written one. Because why couldn't you have two main languages? Why couldn't you have three? What does it mean to have a main language anyway? So in that information though, from 2011, we have no information about Romani languages. So I said that this starting point, our Gypsy language, led us to think about methodologies. I don't know if these terms emic and etic are very familiar to you yet. Maybe not the final year students that I spoke to before. Have you heard of those terms, emic and etic? No, why would you? It's not yet part of it. I don't think I ever heard it when I was in my undergrad courses much later. So etic is considered as an approach that you start from the outsider perspective. You define what you want to look and then you go and look for it. So people say it relates more to the sort of positivist, the recognition of that the truth exists, that you have this category in mind and you go and look for it. Whereas emic starts from the participant's own ideas. So in schools here in Britain, we have this term that the school documents and the government and the ministries of education have used for years, and that is Gypsy Roma Traveller, GRT. We have data about GRT achievement, and it is always the lowest in the country. But when you look at this term, Gypsy Roma Traveller, it's interesting because they say that it is all the English and Welsh gypsies, Irish and Scottish travellers, showmen, fairground people and circus people and bargees, they're the occupational boat dwellers, and the new travellers that are included in that category of Gypsy Roma traveller. Quite a lot of people with different ethnicities, different languages, different histories, different backgrounds, all lumped together. And what unites them is this notion, this vague sort of assumption about travelling. And yet we know that of the British Gypsy Roma traveller people, 10% travel these days. Most are settled. So it's interesting, isn't it, that we call them travellers, that we put them under that same bracket. I think it is odd and confusing, and because it is confusing, I think by the government doing this, it institutionalizes confusion. It's also an example of essentialism. We essentialize one aspect of this group, travelling, and then make that as a kind of the most important feature. And by doing this, education ministries and schools begin to shift the gaze from schools and teachers and what they're doing to the community. That somehow the underachievement in schools is the community's own fault. Shouldn't go travelling. So, because of all these different notions, we wanted to give time to develop trust, and actually gave months and waited for the trust to develop in order to find more about our Gypsy language. One of the researchers became kind of a language detective, I called her, because she was so insistent on finding names for these languages. And also she had won the trust of the communities. She stumbled across this website called the Manchester University website, and this began to give us some solutions, but only partially, some solutions. Okay, so we're going to hear more about the names, but now I'm going to park this bit of the presentation and go to more of the history of Roma. I don't know if many people here know where the Roma came from and who they are, so I'm going to say a little bit about that. They were thought to originate from Egypt because of their slightly darker skin colour and darker hair, and hence the name Gypsy. So they were thought to be Egyptians and hence Gypsies. Similar words in many European languages. In Finnish, mustalainen, which is a word derived from the word black. And the communities themselves say that to them these are potentially offensive terms because they've been used for such a long time in that context. And they tend to prefer Roma. However, as soon as I've said that, of course, some of the very current bodies, like the European Fundamental Rights, migrant rights and minority rights, define anti-Gypsyism, where they use that word as a specific form of racism, ideology founded on racial superiority, a form of dehumanization and institutional racism nurtured by historical discrimination, which is expressed, among others, by violence, hate speech, exploitation and stigmatization. Quite a stark definition what it means, anti-Gypsies. So who are the Roma? Before we go there, just a point about language and dialect. I'm sure you've had here in this room lots of discussions about that. When is a language language and when is it a dialect? we decided very early on to use language, not a dialect, although we've been questioned in many presentations that they're dialects, they're not languages. But we decided they, like Yaron Matra says, they lack the coherent continuous territorial representations because they migrated. The definition of dialect doesn't really work. And anyway, we wanted to raise the status of Romani languages, so we call them languages. So it was very much a social justice driven decision to engage with antagonistic relationships. So who are the Roma? So they are today the largest minority ethnic group in Europe, about 12 million people scattered around Europe. Travellers and nomadic service providers they have been, and as such they've been persecuted for centuries. Henry VIII made it a felony to be seen in the company of Egyptians, so it was a crime if you talked to a gypsy. And of course, being a gypsy, you could be executed just for the sake of being a gypsy. During the Second World War, Roma were also put in concentration camps, and often this genocide is referred to as forgotten Holocaust because it hasn't been talked about as much as other groups during that Nazi regime. So the part of the Romanian colleagues in this study also lend us the authenticity. Here's me, a Finn, living in England, talking about Roma. What do I know about Roma? So the Romanian colleagues lent us and brought into the project much of the authentic experience of today. And here it is. We're going to Tinca, which was one of the villages where some of the Romanian part of the project took place. Much of this village and the surrounding area is poor, but this is where the Romanian people live. This is not where the Roma live. This is not poor in their standards. This is poor. They live on the outskirts of Tinca village on illegal land. It is not their own land, but they have been there for centuries. And they build their own house, and as the families grow, they build another one and another one. But they are very vulnerable. If the landowner wants to sort of get rid of them, they can be got rid of just like that. And of course, these dwellings don't have electricity. There are some where we got electricity, but not all, and there is no running water. There's no rubbish collection. There's nothing. All that sort of infrastructure is lacking. That's where some of these people in the study lived. I've never seen such clean people. I mean, in those harsh conditions, it is fascinating how much they wash their carpets, their clothes and everything, even during the winter, when you don't have water coming to your house. So the old stereotypes that gypsies are dirty clearly is not true. The conditions are harsh, and I remember doing this. Do you remember the shoe boxes just before Christmas, sending gifts? I remember doing it too. And now I was there when they received boxes. There is also a school that we collaborated with very near, because the Roma children are segregated, their education is segregated from other Romanian children, and that is true to much of Eastern Europe. So, they came originally from central India. Why did they leave? We don't know. Maybe they were persecuted, maybe they just moved, maybe it was a combination of different reasons. They migrated towards northern India and then towards Turkey and Greece, the Ottoman Empire. Around 1000 Common Era, they moved towards Central Europe, and by 16th century they were in all parts of Europe. And we know that their language was quite a coherent language up to 14th century. But beyond then, it has started to diversify. So what are their languages? This is a lovely quote I found. Somebody writes in 1697 that it's a mixture of German, Yiddish, Hebrew and phantasmagorical words. It's when you don't know, you just really don't know, do you? But in 1782, a German linguist identified the link between Hindi and Romani, and was able to say that they don't come from Egypt, but rather from areas where people spoke something related to Hindi in those days. So Romani languages belong to the Indo-Aryan group, and they are the only Indo-Aryan language that has been spoken exclusively in Europe since the Middle Ages. And these days linguists group them in 5 bigger language groups. Here they are. But for us, it wasn't at that level that we wanted to explore. We wanted to explore these lesser-known languages within those 5 groups. And this is where this website became absolutely critical for the project. It's free for anybody to use. And it is an amazing database of all these languages or dialects. And what you can do, and what we did, is that for each of these, more or less each of them, there are a range of words, very common words like water, bread, mother, window, identified, and you've got a little sound file, how the speakers of that language say that. So we took this website to the participants and say, you speak your Gypsy, but have a look. When you say bread, what do you say? And they told us. And then we listened, is that this language or that language? And having said all of them sitting in the same room that we speak the same, our Gypsy language, they suddenly started saying, yeah, but I don't say it like that. I say it like this. So we were able to say that, look, it's a different language. And I'll show you a video expert in a minute, but so what I was going to say is that that moment of identifying that my speech is a language was an interesting moment for the speakers themselves. They had never considered that their speech could be framed as language. It was my Gypsy, our Gypsy. So let's have a look. Here they are then, some participants in France looking at these websites.
Mais nous, on ne dit pas glotta, mais nous comprenons parce que j'ai habité là-bas. Dans la zone, on dit c'est glotta.
Voilà, donc à mon avis.
Ça, c'est le cas, ouais, c'est vrai. Ils font les. Comment ça s'appelle les trucs en huile.
Ah oui.
Ça vient de là, que les vaches.
D'accord.
So exactly the same process then was repeated in. So these were the languages then that we found. In England, East Slovak Romani, Ussari and Czech Blacks, and France, Ussari, Romani, Culturare. And because we did not have time to develop those trusting relationships with the families and participants in Finland, we never found out what their languages were. We never found the same level of sort of connections with the families there. Sad, but this is what happens in these projects. So I said about the emic and etic. So what was staggering was when this one father who was translating and looking at the website says, "My speech has a name?" Academics have taken an interest in our speech. There's a website. And then I speak a language. So he goes home. I speak Ursari. Never happened before. So this notion of switching very from ethic as perspectives, linguistics naming languages, to their emic perspectives, that switching created that transformative moment for participants that we called also emancipatory moment. He went home with a different notion of his own identity and language. So East Slovak Romani, of course, then relates to the area where one group of Roma moved to. Slovakia, Eastern Slovakia. So these names reveal something of their roots of migration, fascinating source of where they come from. They also reveal professions, like in the French example they were talking about copper makers or copper smiths. Here are some other language names that are spoken by the Roma. So Kurara is sieve makers, Kalderash kettle smiths, Lovara horse dealers, and so on. And the one that was part of our project is this, Ursari. Those of you who speak Italian or French or Spanish may know that the Latin word for bear is ursus. So these people in the past had been those bear handlers, since often the language was called by the group's profession. So they all engaged in horse dealing or making pots and pans, or indeed handling bears. But here is another ethical problem then, because this name of the language suggests something very backward, primitive and unethical, because bear handling, we look at it today and we say, that's not right, that's absolutely unethical to have a big bear and keep that as a sort of a circus animal and just for the fun of people. So we were worried that using this word would strengthen the stereotype, you know, them gypsies, them backward, dirty people. But in the context of knowing something of their history, we need to accept that they were slaves in the past. They were not free people. And being a bear handler was the only, possibly, the only profession available to them. So it wasn't that they chose to be bear handlers, but they had to be. So, our gypsy language. They didn't use Ursari, they used our gypsy language. Excavating, what does that word, what does that name mean for the community themselves? We began to understand their own agency, their resistance. That if these marginalized people have been called names that suggest something backward and primitive and wrong, then they reject it. They don't use it. They don't want to identify their speech and their history with the outsiders who've been the dominating force. They don't want that. So they use their own, more authentic and positive alternatives, which often have remained hidden from the rest of the society. And this was absolutely staggering that they talk to us about our Gypsy language being a very, very positive term. Not a term of submission, not a term of ignorance, but a term to develop mass solidarity. So they say it as we all are marginalized. Let's unite us by the term Gypsy, our Gypsy language. So for them, finding strength in the unity of other Roma groups actually overpowered the need or even an interest in pinpointing a specific language name. So they said to us, some of these Roma activists, that it's interesting, but it's not our main concern. It might be interesting for you, but for us is to create this buffer of protection that protects us against the outside world. And that's a way of doing this. Our Gypsy is not a term of ignorance, like I said. It is about creating this strength in the unity. So a new question for us then, research team. So who do we serve? Do we serve the linguistics, the academics, with good salaries? Are we going to benefit from it by being invited to places to talk? Or do we serve the Roma people themselves? Really tricky questions that we've been talking and talking and talking about amongst ourselves and with others. Because we've been worried about that in our quest to find these names, we might fragment that fragile, already fragile Roma identity. So there we come along and then suggest names, and it takes away from the community. So the Romani language names revealed European-wide non-naming and silencing by formal bodies such as European Union, Erasmus+, to UK census. Wherever you look, and I haven't here had time to talk about the similar practices in Finland or France or Romania. The names also reveal information of their past professions and their routes of marginal migration, where they've been. But they also show about something about social exclusion. And finally, they show something about the attempts to resist marginalization. So for us then, social justice and methodologies were important in this project. And for us, research ethics are two things. I think all of you third-year students here, if you're doing your dissertation soon, you probably have to put in an ethics form and tick lots of boxes. Have you done that already? No, not yet. It's coming. So that form and similar approaches tend to be about avoiding harm, making sure that when you go and interview your participants, you don't upset them or somehow misrepresent them. But to us, in this study, research is also about doing good. So it's avoiding harm, but it must be about doing good. Why else do any research? That's what we thought. So there are these two, Israel and Hay, they write about these two different approaches. That there is approach to ethics that they've framed as, or named as, a consequentialist approach that seeks to ensure that action does not result in harm. But there is also another one that is a deontological approach that stresses the consequences and claim a space for acts that are seen good in themselves. So it is important to act in morally just ways. So what we wanted to do was to move from regulatory compliance to ethical contact. Nobody could say that by calling these languages as Ursari or East Slovak dialect, a Romani language, we were somehow unethical in terms of the ethic forms and ethics, sort of the contracts that we've done with European Union or our universities. But you could say that the consequences were morally unjust, not just, towards the Roma themselves. So the point about then how we kind of began to pull these strands together was that sometimes in research methodologies, these two different approaches, the ethic, the outsider, and the enic, the insider, are viewed as oppositional, that they're binaries. You're either this or that. Whereas really, in this project, it was precisely shifting perspectives that created that emancipatory moment for those families. It was about recognizing that there are ethic naming practices and then learning about them. There's a website, it's open for anybody, the whole world. And you can see how many people go there. Stunning. So, public naming for shared purposes and with insiders was something that began to show us that we were ethical enough for our purposes. And I show you some of these examples from the project. So once the parents had translated their languages into Ursari or East Slovak or Kortvari, then we could have these videos with the characters speaking in different languages. Here are two Roma girls and the rest of the group that was working non-Roma, working with the class teacher. And these two girls have been in, it's a year one, so they've been in the school for about 2 years. Here they are then, engaging in an ordinary history lesson. And suddenly, when they hear the characters speak in their own language, they turn to each other like this. And they say, they're speaking in our language. They talk like us, I think she says. Then it's so exciting that this one turns to the teacher and says, Miss, that's my English. Because, again, she didn't have the name for that. It's my English. It's a lovely moment. Teachers who looked at these videos later were stunned because the video characters allowed children every so often to tune in to the topic of the lesson. And whereas one or two of them were en route to a special needs class because the teachers said they are slow learners, they can't learn, suddenly said, I've learned more about my own pupils through these videos than I have for the past 2 years. So these children, some of them were about to be excluded from the school and sent to a special needs class because the teacher said there is a cognitive deficiency in there when they did not know English. So my final words really, perfect, really is that the parents and the grandparents who did the translations and who used their Gypsy language engaged in this work because these teaching resources were used by their children's teachers in ordinary schools. So it wasn't just that they translated or came to talk about their languages, but there was a real need to engage. They shared our purpose. They wanted to support their children in learning. So one father who was a precarious worker, like many of them, that means that has sort of no permanent job or permanent salary or rights, just turns up to different places. He was one of those car wash people who you see outside supermarkets, for example. He gave up 1 day's pay in order to do this research. So I often hear that the Gypsy Roma traveller group achieves really badly in English schools because their parents and families don't care about education. Everything I learned through this project shows me the opposite, that they care very much about education. They can no longer, they cannot provide the best opportunity for them, for their children themselves, so they hope the school can do it. So they value education very much. What they are worried about is schooling. So they value education, but they are worried about schooling. Because like one grandmother said, the level of bullying, the level of teasing, the level of feeling ostracized is so terrible that in her view, school is no place for a child. No child should be sent to school. So, this project showed differently, and it's with that positiveness that I want to finish. Thank you very much. Okay, so I've sort of left a couple, is that okay? Yeah, I've got 5 minutes or so. Do you have any questions? I've galloped through histories and languages and ethnicities and the project. Is there anything you want to ask?
So, you know when the last bit that you were talking about with the children and with them possibly being sent into a special needs class at schools, do you think that if their learning was done within their language, that they would have progressed far greater?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, if you look at the website, we've got our impact report there. So, before, for example, the phonics screening that every school has to do in England when the children are about 6 now, the phonics screening results shot up after this. And of course we can't create, you see, these amazing places in every school. This cost a big part of the project money. We got $250,000 for the whole project, so this took a big size of the money. But this acted as an inspiration for others to say, what can you do? Can you have an iPad and find the languages there? And these days you can. Can you create resources with parents? Can you do dual language books, sort of cheap versions of this? And that's what they did in the other countries. Yeah.
Is the language only spoken or is it written as well?
Right, good question. So it's often said that it's a vernacular and no written form, but then you see them, you see, and they go. So what are they texting? So they're texting often in it's a combination of the place where they lived, so it might be a little bit of Romanian spelling with their own. And of course there is now a written Romani developed from a particular variety in Romania, which they call Romani. And are you? So again we've questioned that. You know, why call it Romani? Why now take that name for that one variety. And since that has now a well-established alphabet and writing, say, orthography and all that sort of, that's been developed, that variety is likely to raise in status. And the ones that are not, it creates again a tension between those two varieties.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Armett. I'm one of the midwifery nursing lecturers with an interest in public health, and I'm very interested in this because I used to manage the language team and
I think you emailed me.
and we were just yesterday teaching
Okay.
student midwives about language, and people even identifying their own language, patois, or someone who spoke a pidgin language from Kiwi from the North Island, so I guess it was a Micronesian, and they were going, no, it's just English. And I think that I suppose it's another kind of oppression, another bit of cultural oppression, which is quite interesting. I just want to make one remark and then ask you a question. I am interested to notice, I've worked with some of the Roma come and speak to our students some years, and sometimes it's Irish travellers or English gypsies, and for other people to know that the difference is Irish travellers like to be called travellers because the word gypsy is associated with these negative things, whereas English gypsies have kind of gone through, a bit like perhaps some Afro-Americans, about reclaiming the N-word as being their word and what they use. So go, no, I'm a gypsy, and be surprised that the Irish traveller is going, It's really interesting kind of how people reclaim and use it as an empowering word. But to remember that there'd be consequences for these language differences. You're right, I didn't know you couldn't look up Erasmus. Very poor language in access in the NHS anyway, and there isn't access. They were saying, well, what do we put down for someone like this? And we had Romanian, Bulgarian students who actually said, well, what about Romani, because there isn't anything we can even ask for it. It's almost like to have it electronically go, is it one of these? And people can go, yes, call me somebody who speaks that. Because I think it's about flexibility. In so the question about in northern Greece, in Macedonia or Trachea, there's a set of people who are called Romani, and I don't know whether that comes from the same word "rum," being unclean, with the Turkish ending "ali" from, or whether they're a different set of migratory people that have all been lumped together by the dominant communities. I don't know whether you heard anything about those.
So there are so many variations, and I was scared that these kinds of questions would crop up.
No, I was just interested.
Because I don't know all. So there is, often we call them Rom or Roma, and there's Lom and Dom, and all sorts of that are somehow related, come from perhaps the same base, but diverged earlier on. That particular one, sorry, I don't know.
And maybe you're right, maybe there's some from Bulgarian, some who've come more recently from Turkish.
Yes,
so maybe.
Yes, yeah. So there are different groups that have a particular sort of southern Russia there, that are not called Roma, but they call them Dom and Lom. And some of those have now almost disappeared, but we know that they exist. It's so complicated. I keep learning. Come back to listen to me maybe a year's time, and I learn. It's been a real transformation for me too. Not ever having been an expert on Roma. Not that I am now, but I am got really interested through the project. Yeah.
I'm an exchange student here, and I study in Belgrade at the Faculty of Philology. And we actually have a module called Contemporary Romani Language.
Wow. Yes. Yes. That's good.
Because we have a large Romani community at Serbia.
Yes, great. Yes. Good. So you might know more.
Probably.
It might be a good connection for me.
Yes.
Yes.
I do know, I actually know some words from the language they speak there.
Right, excellent. Yes. Good.
Have we got time for another question?
Yeah.
Can you flip back about 5 slides for me?
First.
If you can go back about 4 or 5 slides.
This.
Okay, it doesn't matter. I think it was the last comment on one of the slides. It was suggesting this question about being very, very careful in not intruding on the owners, the speakers of these languages, to make distinctions between them that may cause them to be rather negative towards those who don't speak their version of the language. And I just wondered whether you were implying that naturally, as people with different versions of the language come into contact with one another, they don't notice that difference, because presumably there are significant elements of the languages that they speak that are distinctive enough for them to notice, hey, these aren't quite the same as me. And the reason I mention that is a personal one, if I can just quickly sentence it. My wife is essentially a second generation Greek Cypriot. Spent a lot of her time in Cyprus. Both her parents are Greek Cypriot. She speaks fluent Greek. But when she goes back there from time to time, people will say, oh, you're a Cypriot, are you? And then they stop and say, no, they say, you're a Charlie. And the word Charlie is a derogatory term they use for somebody who was an inhabitant of Cyprus, but since left to go and work overseas. So even that subtle distinction within exactly the same language, not even from Greece, but from within Cyprus, can be a cause of dissension or difference that they create amongst themselves. I just wondered whether you found the same thing within the Romani people.
I mean, absolutely, that different teams in different countries spoke more about that. In France, for example, and we were really aware of the potential of suggesting that you don't belong here, you belong there, and that there is some kind of a power dimension going on between those different groups. That did arise. And that made us question, so what on earth are we doing with this work when it isn't our language, and when we're about to step into so many different traps and kind of create more difficulties than we are hoping to do. But the only way that we could come over that was really look at the overall project and what we aim to do, and the impact it had on the children in the schools where they were. So in France, for example, regardless of those possibly difficult conversations, the attendance in school has risen since the project. So they attend more regularly than they did before. So that's my answer. I'm aware of it, and I'm aware that tomorrow somebody could be sitting here who challenges me on some front that I've suggested inadvertently here. And I have no idea that I've done that. So I'm very aware of it. And now the public, that's why I've been wrangling with this all summer. It's almost ready to be sent as a journal article. Framing it in a way that we want to... So what do you do in a project such as this? What do you do? To write it as a methodological paper about considering the ethics of your practice and the situation in which you do. That's where you need to consider the ethics and consider the consequences of different people for different times. But it's, so I'm waffling now.
No, it's a really important thing for anyone who's doing research. It's like,
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
But it's difficult, yes.
Good, thank you.
Okay,
Thank you. And on that note, thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you.